1950s. We're now going to talk about McCarthyism and all that fun stuff, all right? Now, immediately after World War I, if you remember, we had a Red Scare where we were afraid of a communist takeover. After World War II, very similar. There is a Red Scare, but really in the 1950s, it takes off. Really, really big. And that is due in part to a young senator, maybe not necessarily young in age, but young in experience, named Joseph McCarthy. All right? And some of this should make sense as we go through this, all right? So Joseph McCarthy is a senator, and he is out to hunt communists. Now, this had been coming along, and I'll walk you through it here in a second. We need to get this. Now, he actually creates McCarthyism. And McCarthyism, by definition, is where you're going to accuse somebody of being a threat, whether being a communist, or we can change it to terrorist now, right? Or a witch, as you'll see here in a second, without just really any regard for the evidence. Now, Joseph McCarthy famously got up there and said, I have a list of names. And naturally, if anybody starts mentioning names, we get interested. Is he a rat? How do you find this out? Etc. So McCarthyism takes America by storm. And he gets tons of names of people, and they keep tabs on these communists. And even after he loses favor, that really continues. Now, Joseph McCarthy, if you are in 11th grade English, you are reading Arthur Miller's The Crucible about the Salem witch trials. And Joseph McCarthy bears a resemblance, a parallel, if you will. And there's a lot of parallels in this book to this, to the judge in The Crucible. Namely, if the judge in The Crucible said you were a witch and you denied it, you were a witch. If Joseph McCarthy said you were a communist, even if you denied it, you were a communist. And so there's many other parallels there. There's a lack of evidence. There's a panic that sweeps over the country, etc. And so that panic that is created is called the Red Scare. All right, and this is the second Red Scare. It goes from about 1945, really starts happening there, all the way until about really into the 1960s. So the idea behind the Red Scare was that we were afraid that, as you can see here, the country is being taken over, it's becoming red. Red is the color we associate with communism back in the Cold War, if you remember that time. McCarthyism happens the same time that Korea starts. And so, as I had you read there's a guy from the Rosenbergs, I'll get to in a second, that said Joseph McCarthy had to be. There had to be a menace. There had to be something to support this. Now, as shown by this little thing here, the red iceberg, right? USA is floating along in these international waters, and they can see all the countries who have died or fallen to communism. We have Poland, Hungary, China, Czechoslovakia, North Korea, and East Germany. And so we are determined not to fall to communism at any cost, right? And this is where things start to get a little interesting. Because if you remember, anytime the things come in question, you can say it with me if you want. Which is more important? National security or personal freedom? National security will always win out. All right? Now, before McCarthy, there existed a committee that was made right around 1947 called the House Un-American Activities Committee. Now, you can tell from this propaganda here that this person has said that terror went through the Bill of Rights, and the Un-American Committee kind of blotched the Bill of Rights in pursuit of that terror, and they said it was okay. Now, a more telling cartoon would be this one, and this is the abbreviation of HUAC, by the way, House Committee on Un-American Activities. Now, if you've ever heard the expression of stepping on someone's toes or something like that, that's what's going on here. They're running over people, and people are getting hit, and your rights are being stepped on, your rights are being thrown about. It doesn't really matter. We're running the stop sign. That's a big thing, Maybe some laws are being broken. And the guy riding a shotgun says, it's okay, we're hunting communists. So the House Un-American Activity Committee really did some things that might have seemed a little weird, but they did. Now, a famous person on the House Un-American Activity was Richard Nixon in the 40s, before he is vice president under Eisenhower and later runs for president. So, interesting stuff there. Now, McCarthy and also the HUAC, really the HUAC started doing this first off. They'll have a loyalty review program in which they went to people who were suspected of being communist, and they asked them a series of questions to determine if they were communist or not. Now, in your packet there's some stuff by Paul Robeson, also Dalton Trumbo, different things like that, where they ask them, are you currently or have you ever been a member of the Communist Party of America? And other questions of that nature. Now, the idea behind this was to weed out who was not loyal to the United States and to prevent this internal thing. If you remember, Eisenhower built the highway system to make sure, as we talked about the other day, to make sure in case of communist invasion. I mean, we were panicking. Okay? Now, the Loyalty Review, they really and truly, they target teachers. They target college professors. Now, why did they do that? College professors shaped minds, and a lot of the college professors actually refused to take it and were fired. Okay? Now, to make this maybe a little better, how it starts spreading out, McCarthyism kind of later branches out into the McCarran Act. Now, the McCarran Act kind of went hand in hand against unions. You remember, unions are born out of Bolshevik idea, out of the Soviet Union. They'd been here for a while, but it is a socialist concept. Everybody is taken care of. Now, the McCarran Act said if you wanted to be in a union, you had to register. Now, they make an interesting parallel here, and you can make for your decision for yourself if you like this. They have a swastika here. See that? And it says, will you register on the McCarran Act? If you remember, the Nazis, they started by outlining the communists, then they made the Jewish people register with them, and then ultimately it led to the Holocaust. And so they're making an interesting parallel here, and you can decide for yourself if you like it. But in their mind, if they didn't do something about the unions, the labor, they would first go to strikes and walkouts, and then it would be disorder and riots in the streets, and then there'd be murders and Bolshevikism, which means turning capitalism on its head, chaos, and then what's next. And so it's a step-by-step process. Now, the next act we have is called the Smith Act. And the Smith Act took it a little bit step further. If you remember back in a court case called Schenck versus the United States, Mr. Schenck was accused of passing out communist leaflets telling people to resist the draft in World War I. He went to jail, and it was a big question. They ultimately decided, hey, you can't say stuff in time of war. You can't yell fire in a crowded theater and not get away with it. Now, the Smith Act kind of branches on that, I guess you will. Kind of not. It actually laid out a punishment. If you did anything that could be deemed by the HUAC to be disloyal or anything like that, 5 years. 5 years in prison. Federal time. And so that's a scary concept under the Smith Act. And then, of course, later on we have McCarthy. Now, this kind of Red Scare branched out to everywhere, and this is just something cool here. Right around this time, Captain America is created, and this was done to get young boys in tune with America and the Stars and Stripes. And his main nemesis, if you will, is a guy named Red Skull. And Red Skull is, of course, red for communism. And so that's just an interesting little tidbit, if you will, before we move to the next thing. Okay? Now, McCarthyism is kind of gaining steam, saying there's people in the Communist Party, and we've got to have proof. Now, one of the names that comes out that is recruited and looked into by a journalist is Alger Hiss. Now, Alger Hiss, probably the worst all-time name if you're accused of doing something, because they're going to think you're a snake when the snake is not a dishonest animal. See Jungle Book, okay? Now, Alger Hiss worked for the government, and he was accused, if you will call it, by McCarthy of being a spy, okay? Now, remember, we don't have proof. That's the highlight of McCarthyism. You're a communist, and we're good. There popped up a journalist named Whittaker Chambers who said, I have proof that Alger Hiss is indeed a communist spy. And they said, where's the proof? And he goes, I got to take it to you. And this is going to sound maybe as funky as it is, and we're almost Halloween time when I'm publishing this video here. He hid the evidence inside of a pumpkin, and we call these the pumpkin papers. All right? Dun, dun, dun. Kind of silly, right? Now, what did the pumpkin papers reveal? They did not, in fact, reveal that Alger Hiss was a communist. We didn't have enough proof. But Alger Hiss did get federal time. If you've seen any court show, you know when they take you up on the stand, you are put under oath. That means you promise to tell the truth. And this is a good thing to learn later in life, especially males. Don't ever lie. You get caught in your lie, and it's a difficult thing to get out of. The same told true about court. There exists something called perjury, and perjury means lying under oath. For example, let's look at this little cartoon. It's kind of funny. Two guys in a jail cell, and one says, "Oh, you say you're here for perjury, huh? Why shouldn't I believe that?" And perjury is lying under oath, so you can't believe anything they say. That's the joke. Come on. So he lying under oath is perjury. Some other famous people who were convicted, maybe of perjury, if you remember, or you haven't talked about it yet, Bill Clinton will have impeachment charges brought up against him because of perjury. Really, they didn't care about his relationship with Monica Lewinsky. They cared about the fact he lied about it and covered it up, among other things. And then also Barry Bonds was tried for perjury because he said he did not take steroids, and then some people produced some documents that said otherwise. So make sure that if you're ever called in to witness or something for that you do not perjure yourself, because you will go to prison. It's a federal offense. All right? Now, the next group that McCarthy turns his sights on after he's got kind of this semi-victory, I will, of Alger Hiss, is 10 Hollywood actors convicted of being communist or accused of being a communist, and they are slangily called the Hollywood 10. Now, to become a communist, basically in Hollywood, you had to appear in a movie that had a communist overtone to it. That's about it. And so what happened to these suspected communists in Hollywood? They are what is called blacklisted. And so what is blacklisted? Blacklisted means if they brought you a list of names, people to consider for part, their name would not be there. Now, if you see here on the sign right here, there's a guy named Dalton Trumbo. There is a movie coming out very, very shortly about Dalton Trumbo and this whole to-do. It should be fairly interesting. I want to see where they're going to take it. How historically accurate is it? It should be really cool. In your packet, I gave you some stuff about Dalton Trumbo. All right? And so there you have blacklisted. Now, much like Sacco and Vanzetti, we have two people that are put to death. And the question is, should these people have been put to death? We'd later find out evidence that will prove either innocence or guilt, and I'll get there in a second. I introduced to you Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. All right, they are rounded up by McCarthy around this time, and they're pulled in, and they're convicted of being atomic spies. The big thing is who's going to have the atomic bomb? How did the Russians get the atomic bomb? We're convinced someone on the inside got a hold of it, and so that's what they're holding them for. They called them the atomic spies, if you will. Now, famously, they will be sentenced to the electric chair, to death. And on their anniversary, nice gift, I guess, they are put to death. Now, the question is, was it like Sacco and Vanzetti? If you remember Sacco and Vanzetti, they were Italian immigrants because of nativism, things like that. They were put to death, and we don't have enough evidence to prove or disprove. Now, in the case of the Rosenbergs, we have either enough to prove or disprove, and we'll talk about that here right now. After they are gone, there is a project put out called Project Venona. It's Venona. And Project Venona basically cracked the Russian spy code. The way they communicated, who's in their syndicate, their network, whatever. And then names start flowing out. And two of those names should seem fairly familiar. It's Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. So Project Venona, in fact, proved that, yes, they were spies. So we were wrong with Sacco and Vanzetti, possibly, we don't know. But we were definitely right with the Rosenbergs. So 50% in bad, right? Well, it is if you're playing with lives. All right? Now we move to the end. Joseph McCarthy really started in 1950, and as Korea is winding down in 53, so is McCarthyism and his political career for that matter. Joseph McCarthy, famously towards the end, accused some very high-level generals in the U.S. Army of being communist. And now if you do that, you have to have a Senate hearing, and they got to go in. Now, first thing about this, it is televised. Now, no one had seen the way McCarthy operated at this point. And what did they see? They saw bullying, they saw intimidation, they saw badgering witnesses, which means you're trying to get something out of them. And we as Americans, we don't hold bullies too high. We have anti-bullying campaigns in all the schools because, it's something we need to do. Now, famously, okay, it is there. The defense, or the guy who was basically going against McCarthy, famously said, "Mr. McCarthy, you have no sense of decency. We've heard enough." And America will agree with him that McCarthy doesn't have a sense of decency, that he would accuse anybody. So what is the end of result of McCarthyism in the Army McCarthy hearings? Because of what they saw on TV, the badgering of witnesses, the intimidation, the bullying, if you will, McCarthy loses support for his communist witch hunt. Do you want to go that route? And he will be officially censured. That basically means it's a formal disapproval. So the Senate put labels on all of the stuff that he said, and they basically said, we formally disapprove of this. And sadly, this has maybe a sad tone, if you will. McCarthy went back to his home and developed a pretty nasty alcoholic habit in which it cost him his life. And so that's just kind of a sad story, if you will. But at the same time, we did learn something from this, and that is America needs to pay more attention to the evidence rather than the big story. And we still haven't learned that yet. Right? The last thing is the cool part, probably. But we'll get there in a second.